I am super excited to talk to this guy. He is an author. He is a journalist. He is a blogger. His blog now is called Pluralistic, and he is a digital rights advocate. Please welcome to the show, Cory Doctorow. Cory, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for doing this. I'm excited to talk to you. So, I want to start just super basic because I'm curious to know this. Um, what got you into this space in the first place? I mean, you have been, in this space and on top of these issues for a long time now. What got you into it in the first place?
Well, like I tell young computer science students who ask me about getting a career in the industry, if you don't have the foresight and good judgment to be born in 1971, I can't really help you. Being born in 71, and especially having a dad who was a computer scientist, meant that I had an Apple II Plus in 1979 and grew up with modems and BBSs and just was always very interested in technology, which was fringe activity until it wasn't. And then it was like the white hot center of industry. And there were employers who were very anxious to bring people in, irrespective of their formal credentials. So after going to weird-ass alternative schools in Toronto for a long time, I dropped out of 4 undergraduate programs, ended up working as a programmer, started some early web companies, then did a tech startup, and then ended up through that startup working with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a digital rights group. And that kind of merged the other strain of my growing up, which was political activism, human rights activism, and activism related to anti-nuclear proliferation. Growing up in Canada, that was a very big issue because of our role in supplying uranium and also our role in NORAD and cruise missile testing and so on. And so this long-standing work that I'd had in activism on traditional progressive issues and technology really came together with Electronic Frontier Foundation. A couple of years later, I moved to Europe to be their European director, and have been active with them off and on ever since. It's been nearly 20 years now. And at the same time, I was writing and publishing. I started selling stories to science fiction magazines as a teenager, doing journalism, first entertainment journalism, then more investigative work, and now kind of mix of opinion, a little bit of investigation, and got involved in starting one of the first very successful blogs, Boing Boing, which I still co-own and worked on daily for 19 years until last year. And so all of those things just stitched together. It was a very lucky moment. I was like born in the right time at the right place. I had parents who had benefited enormously from a big social services network that saw my parents, who both came from very working class backgrounds. My father was a refugee, end up with tertiary education and a good union jobs as teachers. That meant that, I had a lot of comfort to pursue things that were interesting to me. And it paid off really well. It turned me into someone who was able to chart a course that didn't exist when I started charting it, right? To find something new.
So I wanted to ask you about the EFF specifically a little later, but since it came up naturally, I'll ask you about that now. Can you kind of go into detail about the Electronic Frontier Foundation, what it is all about, what their mission is, how it has evolved since you've been part of it, and your role in it?
So EFF is one of the very oldest of the digital rights organizations, and it comes out of this moment really early on when there were a lot of questions being raised about how human rights and civil rights would apply in the digital world. And, some people said, well, we wouldn't need them, right? Like that maybe we could use cryptography to make governments irrelevant, and then we wouldn't need to secure ourselves from them, nor from other people who wanted to do us harm. And we could just sort of live this kind of digitally maintained paradise. That was not EFF's position. There were other people who said it was irrelevant, right? That to talk about human rights in the same breath as technology is to somehow elevate like the arguments of sad nerds about Star Trek to, Martin Luther King crossing the bridge and having Bull Connor's dog set on him. And that's not where real human rights work takes place. And EFF's founders, who were some pretty early technology pioneers, they had the idea that human rights and digital rights would merge. That as the internet became more central to our lives, that those two things would become the same thing. And so they argued a string of very important early cases. They won the Steve Jackson Games case, which was the case that said that if the police seize an email server, they need a warrant to read the email. It came out of a hilarious, weird thing where in Austin, Texas, there was an RPG publisher who published like tabletop Dungeons and Dragons style games called Steve Jackson. And the FBI raided them because they thought that their cyberpunk tabletop game might have some nexus with cybercrime, and seized their BBS and started reading their email. More importantly, EFF won a really important early lawsuit that legalized civilian access to cryptography and ended the NSA's ban on strong cryptographic tools in civilian hands, which is how there's a little S in the HTTPS in your browser bar right now. That's that cryptography that we legalized. And since then, we fought a lot of important high-profile cases, and we continue to do that work. When I started with EFF, it was literally half a dozen people. Now it's about 100. I am always amazed at what my colleagues there are working on. We publish software tools. We litigate. We work on international treaties. We have affiliations with other groups like ours all over the world. And we have a national network within the US called the Electronic Frontiers Alliance of community groups that work autonomously but collectively with us to attain local goals related to digital technology and human rights. For example, restrictions on the police use of facial recognition technology, or just requirements that the cops put out to tender a public notice when they decide to buy new digital surveillance technology, whether that's a fake cell phone tower that can sniff your cell phone as you move through time and space, or a license plate camera, or much more nefarious hacking tools. And so all that work goes on today, and it's the intersection of law, policy, and technology, and we have hackers and lawyers and activists like me, and we all work together.
Yeah, it's one of those things. When I started coming around to these issues, it would have been around 2005 or so. So by that point, EFF was a big player on campus, and so. But then when you trace the timeline, and you see that it goes back to, I believe, 1990, you just kind of like, you look at that and you just think, wow, they really had some foresight, and I don't know how they pulled this off. I'm thrilled they did, but I don't know how.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think that it, I kind of poo-pooed the kind of cyber utopian vision, but there is an element of cyber utopianism in EFF, which is to say that its early founders and staffers and supporters, as well as those today, weren't just scared about how technology might be abused to take away things that are important to the human struggle for justice and freedom, but also they were excited about what technology gave them, right? They had found online friendship, love, the ability to gather people around causes, just camaraderie and all kinds of things that were worth fighting for. And the very early response to technology from lawmakers and from law enforcement, and to a lesser extent from intelligence agencies, was very bad. And so there was this kind of perfect storm where you have people who really cared about this stuff, who'd found in it some really important potential for living their best life, for technological self-determination, who felt a really significant threat because, you had lawmakers who were just like, not just clueless, because, you can be a clueless lawmaker on a technical subject and still make good law, right? Like, no one in Congress has a microbiology degree, and yet somehow they manage to pass laws and regulations that keep us from all dying of giardia when we drink our tap water, right? But just willfully clueless, just like wrong in really important ways. Like in 1986, Ronald Reagan signed the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, America's first landmark cybersecurity statute. It's a really bad law. It continues to be abused today. It's a real serious thorn in everyone's side. Reagan was stampeded into signing that law after seeing Matthew Broderick in the movie War Games and panicking that America wouldn't be able to fight hacking crimes. And so that was the level of discourse, right? So unlike, say, water safety, where you might expect a microbiologist to come and advise some staffers and an expert regulator and so on, you just had Ronald Reagan watching VHS cassettes of Matthew Broderick hacking the Whopper and signing laws off the back of that. And I think that really made people realize that they would have to fight, right? That they could lose a lot if they didn't.
Well, I think when it comes to digital rights, I always make the joke. It's you look at Marjorie Taylor Greene and you realize we have two types of elected officials when it comes to digital rights: people who don't understand the internet and people who can't handle the internet. And they're making our laws. And I think in a lot of ways that's true. But to your point, I think that it also just comes down to asking the right questions of the right people. You don't need to be like engulfed in digital rights if you're an elected official to just, make good policy. You just have to ask the right people, folks like the EFF, folks like Free Press, folks like Fight for the Future. The organizations are out there. They're available. You just have to ask them. And so many people don't bother taking that step, especially people with power.
I think it's actually worse because oftentimes they will hear from experts and then disregard them because someone has come along to offer some wishful thinking. So, like a couple of areas where this happens a lot. One is internet voting, which is a terrible thing that no one should ever talk about doing because it's stupid and we can't do it. Like there's a pretty broad consensus among the computer science community that is just never going to work because maintaining a ballot that is both secret and secure and remote is just it's a mug's game. We shouldn't have touchscreen voting machines. We shouldn't have online voting. We should be, to the greatest extent possible, counting slips of paper. That's how we do it in Canada, where I grew up. It's how we do it in the UK, where I lived for 13 years. Lots of advanced democracies do it. There are some problems with the complexity of American ballots that might require you to maybe break that stuff down. But in terms of not just the risk to elections, but the risk to the legitimacy of an election, which is something that we're really living through right now, not that an election was stolen, but that credible claims about stolen elections have delegitimized an election for a large proportion of the population. That risk from digital technology is far too high. We should just not do it. And yet there are a lot of vendors, right? And those vendors are pretty concentrated. ES&S is the largest of them. They're really the elephant in the room here. And like all monopolists, they extract a lot of money because monopolists don't have to compete on price, and so they can charge more. Like all monopolists, they don't have to settle a lot of intra-industry disagreements in order to spend that money to attain policy. And so you have this like very unified chorus calling for more digital technology in our elections when really we should be having much less digital technology in our elections. Or, the very long-standing idiotic dream of intelligence agencies and law enforcement to backdoor our encryption. So to say that we should have encryption that works perfectly if criminals are trying to break into your data, whether they're trying to break into a government agency or trying to break into your personal data, but it should fail catastrophically the minute criminals use it to protect their own data. And that somehow we can have encryption that both works perfectly and fails catastrophically depending on who uses it, which again is a thing that like the computer science community is about as unified on this as the climate science community is on the idea of anthropogenic climate change. And just like with anthropogenic climate change, if you shop hard enough, you can find a few people who, because they're cranks or because they're on someone's payroll or because they have a sincerely held wrong belief, will say that the impossible is possible. But, the overwhelming technical consensus of both government computer scientists and computer scientists who work in elite institutions and with the largest corporations is that this is just an idiotic, incoherent idea. It's been around since the Clinton years. So 25 years later, we are still arguing about it. And that, is not a failure to ask the right people. It's a failure to listen to them. Yesterday, Australia's security minister said that there is no reason that anyone should need strong encryption. Now Australia is a particularly egregious offender. They had a prime minister a couple of years ago who, when they were informed that the laws of mathematics mean that you can't make strong crypto that doesn't work when criminals use it, he said, and I quote, "The laws of mathematics are all very well and good, but I think you'll find that in Australia, the law of Australia is the law." So math can go fuck itself.
That's a heavy stand.
Yeah, I mean,
That's a pretty heavy stand.
I've heard a lot of stupid things said about tech policy, but honestly, like, if we ever bring the Olympics back, Australia should compete on stupid technology policy pronouncements because they will bring them the gold.
You think they'll even beat out the United States?
Oh, hell yeah. No. I mean, Australia is a country where once you start going, oh, that's the Texas of Australia, you realize that there's like at least 5 Texases of Australia.
Fair enough. So right now, like, you would say it's pretty much paper ballots or bust right now.
I mean, there's a place maybe in the world for a human readable ballot marking device. There are some problems with human readable ballot marking devices, but there's a place for them. You know, the big question that always comes up when we talk about U.S. elections and paper ballots is that tallying a complex paper ballot is hard when you have 25 different issues on it, right? When there's a bunch of ballot initiatives and a whole bunch of different races and so on. And so, you know, this argument goes that you can have paper ballot marking devices that then produce a machine readable ballot that you can count automatically, but that you can hand recount, though it will be very complex. And then you get the best of both worlds. I think that this is not great. I think that, you know, that waiting an extra couple hours while a more complex hand tallying is undertaken might be preferable. It's an area where we could do some empirical research, like we could find out what the error rate is on hand tallying ballots of the complexity that we see in U.S. regional elections. I've only just applied for U.S. naturalization, so I've never cast a ballot in this country. I've only seen sample ballots. So I'll have a more informed opinion when I finally get to actually go down to my local ballot box and cast a vote.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and make it our own. Get your